Welcome to Sonara's Deep Dive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a philosophical tradition that's, endured for millennia. A civilization famous all over the world for its deep spiritual traditions.
The relentless pursuit of moksha.
Exactly. Liberation from suffering. This veneration of these vast, ancient, sacred texts. Now, try to picture a school of thought that grew up and flourished inside that very civilization, a system that rejected every single one of those core ideas.
It's an intellectual insurgency. I mean, we're talking about a philosophical movement, staggering proportions. It was an organized, long-lived rebellion against the fundamental architecture of the Indian universe.
A philosophy that just flat out denied the authority of the Vedas.
Denied the Vedas, rejected the existence of the soul, dismissed the entire law of karma, and basically just laughed at the concept of an afterlife.
Absolutely. Our mission today is a deep dive into this incredible counterpoint. The school of Cārvāka, which is often known as Lokāyata. We are looking at what was, arguably the most radical, materialist, and ruthlessly rational philosophical system in all of Indian history.
And here is the profound challenge, and what makes this deep dive so necessary. We know Cārvāka primarily, almost exclusively, through the writings of its opponents.
So we're not reading their own words.
Almost never. Its original foundational texts, like the Bhagavat Sutra, they were systematically suppressed and are almost entirely lost to history. It's like trying to understand an entire political movement just by reading attack pamphlets written by the opposition.
Which means we're essentially performing intellectual archaeology here.
Yeah.
We're reconstructing the DNA of this potent, persistent challenger based on, fragments and refutations.
That's it. Our goal is to understand what this controversial school truly believed, why it was so relentlessly condemned, and how its core ideas, this radical empiricism and materialism, sound startlingly similar to modern Western skepticism, centuries and centuries ahead of its time.
So where do we even start? The name?
Let's start with the name itself, because the names tell you everything you need to know about the fierce intellectual battle that surrounded this school. The name Lokāyata is the older, more general term. It translates simply as prevalent among the people, or, the philosophy of the commoners.
That sounds almost democratic, really.
It does, but that very popularity was used against it. It quickly got a derogatory connotation. The establishment argued that Lokāyata was just sophistry, or that it belonged to people with unrefined taste.
Intellectually vulgar.
Exactly. It suggested the masses only followed it because, it gave them an excuse to ignore difficult spiritual duties.
Then you have Cārvāka, which is the name we often associate with the specific philosophical doctrine. And this name is just fascinatingly layered, isn't it? It's completely tied up with the ethical critique.
One popular interpretation comes from the Sanskrit root karv, which means to eat or to chew.
Right, which leads directly to that infamous hedonistic motto often pinned on them: eat, drink, and be merry.
And that immediately frames the follower as a pleasure seeker, someone prioritizing immediate sensual fulfillment above all else. But there's another, more sophisticated reading that some scholars favor. A Cārvāka might mean a person who is sweet-tongued, or charu, but who eats up their own words, vak.
So an eloquent deceiver, someone who sounds good but has no real regard for morality or truth.
Precisely. They were seen as skilled persuaders leading the unwary astray. So the very labels they carried, from the popular lowbrow philosophy to the sweet-tongued deceiver, were basically pieces of intellectual propaganda.
They were used to discredit the system before its arguments could even be heard.
Absolutely. And finally, you have the historical, or let's say mythological anchor, Bahaspatya. It's named after its supposed founder, the legendary sage Bahaspati.
And he's credited as the author of their foundational text, the Bhagavat Sutra.
Right, which gives the school this respectable ancient lineage, even though the content Bahaspati allegedly produced, radical atheism, is precisely what the traditional religious authorities despised so much.
Okay, so to really grasp the shock factor of Cārvāka, you have to place it within the traditional philosophical landscape of ancient India. Most people imagine this sort of monolithic spiritual culture, but it was highly stratified.
It really was.
Cārvāka wasn't just disagreeing on details, it was fundamentally rejecting the entire operating system of the cosmos, as everyone else understood it.
We can start with the great philosophical sorting mechanism. There were two major camps, and they were defined by their relationship to the foundational sacred texts, the Vedas.
First, you have these astika, the orthodox schools. These are the ones that accepted the divine, ultimate authority of the Vedas. This includes the heavyweights like Vedanta, Mimamsa, and Nyaya.
And then you have the Gnostica, or the heterodox schools, those that explicitly rejected the Vedas as the ultimate source of truth.
The most famous Gnostica schools were Jainism, Buddhism, and of course our subject, Cārvāka.
And this is where Cārvāka's radical isolation becomes so clear. I mean, Jainism and Buddhism or Gnostica, sure, they rejected the Vedic priesthood and rituals.
But they were intensely spiritual and ethical systems themselves. They were still focused on escaping suffering, on attaining liberation.
Exactly. They were just offering a different path to the same ultimate goal. But Cārvāka was unique because it rejected the goal itself. Almost every other Indian philosophical system, spiritual or not, wrestled with three central, non-negotiable questions that defined reality.
The first, and maybe the most pervasive, being the law of karma.
This cosmic moral ledger, yeah. The idea that every single action you take produces future results, good or bad, which you have to experience.
And the second is the cycle of birth and death, reincarnation, which is really just the necessary machinery for experiencing all those karmic results.
Right. If you build up merit, you need a future life to enjoy it. If you accrue demerit, you need a future life to suffer for it.
And the third, the ultimate solution to the whole mess, liberation or moksha. The final release from that endless, often painful cycle of struggle and rebirth.
And Cārvāka was the only major philosophical system to look at those three fundamental questions, karma, rebirth, and liberation, and just declare them all irrelevant.
Because the whole premise was false to them.
The whole premise was false. They rejected the metaphysical architecture entirely, which, as you can imagine, is why they were so aggressively condemned.
And their rejection wasn't just, philosophical, it was overtly political. Cārvāka saw established religion, particularly the orthodox Vedic system, as a profound mechanism of social control. They bluntly called it the biggest evil.
Their critique was targeted, laser-focused on the priestly class, the Brahmins. They accused them of inventing these elaborate religious structures solely for their own self-enrichment. It was, in their view, a classic mechanism of economic exploitation masked by a spiritual mandate.
And the mechanism of this exploitation is so key. The Vedas were considered shruti, what is heard, divinely revealed, but they were chanted and interpreted by the priests in Sanskrit.
A language the common person did not understand. This created an immediate knowledge hierarchy. If you can't verify the contents of the ultimate truth yourself, you're forced to accept the priest's claims on faith. Claims about ultimate metaphysical rewards like heaven, or punishments like hell.
Which, in turn, mandated specific rituals and mandatory sacrifices. And these rituals were not cheap.
Oh, they were incredibly expensive. They involved gifts, food, animals, time, all of it directed toward the priests as the intermediaries. Paspati, the founder, allegedly declared that these elaborate rules and rituals were nothing more than a clever way for the upper-class priests to guarantee themselves a comfortable life.
By tricking the masses into accepting fables about the soul and the next world as truth. So their materialism was a kind of populist revolution. They were trying to warn the common person against being swayed by what they saw as the spiritual materialism of the Brahmins, who were getting vast wealth in the name of the unobservable.
The irony is rich, isn't it? They were condemning the economic and political effects of seeking non-existent spiritual wealth, while at the same time advocating for the enjoyment of actual, tangible, material wealth.
Okay, now let's move into the intellectual core of Cārvāka. How they determined what was true. This is where their thought gets really radical and, well, uncannily anticipates the Enlightenment.
Right.
Let's unpack this. Cārvāka insisted on radical and rigorous empiricism. Their axiom was starkly simple. If you can't sense it, see it, taste it, or feel it, it doesn't exist.
And this stance defines their entire theory of knowledge, their epistemology. They accepted only one valid pramash, or source of knowledge, perception or prachaka.
So all reliable knowledge has to come solely from sensory inputs, from direct observation.
Yes, if it's beyond sense experience, it is outside the bounds of rational inquiry, period.
This stance immediately puts them into just a ferocious conflict with every other philosophical school, right? Because nearly all of them accept other sources of knowledge, like testimony or analogy, or, and this is the big one, inference or anumana.
And Cārvāka rejected inference wholesale, at least when it came to metaphysical truths. Inference is the process you need to prove unperceivable concepts. God, an immortal soul, the power of a ritual, the operation of karma.
You can't see any of those things.
You can't. And the Cārvāka critique against inference here is arguably the most sophisticated and challenging part of their entire philosophy.
Wait, but if I see smoke, I infer fire. If I see a boat move down a river, I infer it will arrive downstream later. We use inference dozens of times a day. If Cārvāka rejected it entirely, how could they even function?
That's the classic challenge their opponents raised, and it's a good one. It forced the materialists to refine their position over time. But let's first look at their core critique of inference, because it's deeply logical. They argued that inference relies on establishing a universal and necessary connection between two things. This concept is called vyapti.
Like, where there is smoke, there is necessarily fire. That's a vyapti.
Exactly. To prove that necessary connection universally, that it holds true in all possible times and places, past, present, future, across the entire cosmos, you would need to observe that connection in all possible times and places.
Which is impossible.
You, as an individual observer, cannot perceive the entire universe across all of time.
Ah, I see. So any inference I draw is based on my limited past observations. I can only really say, where I've seen smoke, there has been fire. I can't guarantee there isn't some smoke without fire scenario I just haven't seen yet.
And that's precisely their point. The core critique is that using limited past observations to draw a necessary universal conclusion about something unperceivable, like an immortal soul or an eternal righteous God, involves a logical fallacy. They called it the fallacy of petition principle.
Circular reasoning.
Circular reasoning.
Can you break that down? How is it circular when you apply it to the soul?
Okay, so if you try to prove the existence of an immortal soul, you're relying on inference, right? A supposed necessary connection between life and soul. But you can only establish that connection by perceiving it, which you can't do because the soul is unperceivable by definition.
Right.
So to accept the existence of the soul, the conclusion, through inference, you must first assume that the subject of your perception, the body, can host an unperceivable entity. You're assuming the very existence of the unperceivable in your initial premise to prove its existence in your conclusion.
That is a devastating critique of all metaphysics. It completely shuts down any theological argument based on logical derivation.
It does. It forces the Orthodox schools to fall back on pure faith or, unprovable authority of the Vedas, which naturally led their opponents to retort. How can you claim definitively that inference is universally invalid without using inference to arrive at that general principle?
The claim is self-refuting.
It's logically self-refuting, yes. And this tension led to that scholarly evolution you mentioned, where the Cārvāka school had to adapt to survive daily life.
Okay, so who adapted it and how?
Later, more pragmatic materialist thinkers, notably a scholar named Purandara, recognized that rejecting all inference was functionally impractical. You couldn't cross the street, as he pointed out.
So what did Purandara allow?
He allowed for what's called worldly or Lokāyata inference, the observable, verifiable kind. If you see a large object moving quickly towards you, you infer potential harm, and you can verify that inference by observation, either by getting hit or by getting out of the way.
Okay, because those inferences are based on immediate, consistent sensory experience, they're allowed.
They're permissible. But the prohibition remained absolute on transcendental inferences. You can use inference for daily life, but you cannot use it to prove the existence of God or a spiritual realm. And this move actually strengthened the materialist position, making it logically robust in the worldly sphere while keeping its radical skepticism in the transcendental sphere.
They were deeply skeptical of relying on inherited knowledge or easy assumptions.
So deeply skeptical. And to highlight this, we have the famous wolf's footprint anecdote. This story is often recorded by their opponents to show the materialists were deceptive, but it inadvertently celebrates Cārvāka's distrust of blind inference.
Okay, tell us the story. It sounds like a perfect intellectual trap.
So it begins with a husband who was a rationalist, deeply influenced by Gnostic thought, and his wife, who was a staunch Astika, very devoted to the scriptures. The husband was frustrated by her unwavering faith in the unseen and decided to use a material demonstration.
To prove that even wise men who rely on inference can be easily fooled.
Exactly. So late one night, he went out onto the main road where the dust was smooth. Using 3 fingers of both hands pressed together, he made these distinct, regular, 3-pronged prints on either side of his path, repeating the pattern meticulously.
Designed to look like the tracks of a large animal, a wolf or a tiger maybe, heading toward the village.
Right. In the morning, a crowd gathers around these strange tracks, and soon the local wise men and the learned priests arrive to investigate.
And these are the men who rely heavily on textual authority, accumulated knowledge, and inference.
The ones who trust Anumana. So they carefully examine the tracks. After a profound discussion, measuring the distance between the prints, they declare definitively, as the footprints of this wolf cannot be explained otherwise, some beast must have come from the forest and we must increase the security.
So they relied on inference and past knowledge to confirm a threat that didn't exist.
Exactly. The husband then pointed this out to his wife. He said, "My beloved one, consider the case of these footprints of the wolf. These learned men inferred this entire narrative based on my simple finger marks."
The implication being?
The implication was profound. If these learned authorities, using their revered process of inference, could be so easily tricked by a simple, fabricated physical mark, how could you possibly trust their claims about complex spiritual truths that are entirely unverifiable?
Like the rules for righteous conduct or the afterlife?
Right. It's a fantastic story because it shows that Cārvāka's skepticism wasn't just a passive belief. It was an active weapon used against what they perceived as intellectual laziness and deception.
Okay, so let's move from the strict limits of what they knew, sensory perception, to what they believed existed. Their ontology. Cārvāka is defined by its radical material reductionism.
They stripped reality down to the bare essentials.
Their universe is composed of just 4 fundamental material elements, right?
Only 4: earth, water, fire, and air. They were notable because they explicitly denied akasha or space or ether as a 5th element, which most other schools accepted.
And why was that?
Because space, in their view, is not directly perceivable by the senses. It's only inferred as a kind of container for the things you can perceive.
So 4 elements, and that's it. Everything else is just a combination of these.
Precisely. All physical objects, all organisms, the sense organs themselves, they are just temporary products of different combinations and permutations of these 4 primary elements. And existence, therefore, ceases when these elements separate.
That is death. Absolute extinction.
This materialist stance eliminates the need for any non-material component of being. So they absolutely deny the existence of an immaterial soul, the Atman, or a personal spirit that could survive bodily death.
But that brings us back to the classic challenge. How do they explain consciousness?
Right. They asserted that consciousness, or caitanya, is not an inherent property of the elements themselves, nor is it some separate entity residing within the body. Instead, it is a purely emergent property of the material body.
Something that arises specifically from the combination of the 4 elements when they achieve a particular configuration, which is life.
Yes. And the analogy they use for this emergence is brilliant and incredibly memorable: the power of intoxication.
The alcohol analogy.
Yes. Consider alcohol. The individual ingredients that make up a spirituous drink, the grain, the water, the yeast, none of them are intoxicating on their own. They're inert. But when you mix them in a specific way and let them ferment, they produce this powerful, novel, intoxicating property of alcohol.
And consciousness is seen in the same light. A highly sophisticated emergent property, produced only by the living body's unique combination of those 4 elements.
So consciousness is just a temporary side effect of complex chemistry. When those elements separate upon death, consciousness is extinguished entirely, like a fire going out or the intoxicating effect wearing off. There is simply no soul to survive the physical process.
And this non-teleological view, this view without a purpose, it shaped their entire cosmology. If everything is just a matter of material mixing, there's no place for cosmic purpose or fate, or an intelligent creator God guiding events.
Why speculate as to why we are here if the answer isn't available through sensory perception?
Exactly.
The most rational explanation for existence, absent any perceivable divine hand, is that the universe came into existence by chance, by random events, according to fundamental internal laws.
And this fundamental principle is known as svabhava, nature. This concept is crucial because it's the Cārvāka answer to everything.
Svabhava is deterministic and immoral. Nature operates strictly according to its own internal, unauthored laws. This concept allowed Cārvāka to completely reject the moralizing concepts of karma and fate. Things happen because of their nature, not because of some purposeful, divine mandate imposed by a moral judge.
Can you give us a few examples of this concept in action, how svabhava replaces divine purpose?
Sure. The Cārvāka adherents would point to observable phenomena. Why is a thorn sharp? Not because a divine being commanded it, but because that is the natural development, the svabhava of the plant.
Why are the colors of a peacock so vibrant?
Because of the physical properties and development of its body, svabhavana bhavanti haye. Why does fire rise and water fall? Due to their inherent nature. There's no moral reason, no divine reason, just natural law.
It's pure, hard determinism based on verifiable physical forces.
And this approach resolves all the spiritual questions immediately. There is no afterlife because death is certain extinction. Their famous rhetorical question was, when once this frame of ours they burn, how shall it ever again return?
And since there's no invisible judge, there's no spiritual heaven or hell.
They recontextualize those terms entirely. Heaven and hell are experienced here on earth. Heaven is the immediate pleasure and comfort derived from a successful life.
And hell is just the mundane troubles, social difficulties, and physical suffering you experience in this life. No need to wait for judgment.
None at all. And their assertion regarding ultimate authority is one of the most powerful political statements of ancient philosophy. God, the Supreme Lord, is no other than the earthly monarch Lokāyata Raja Parameshvara.
The king.
The king, the ruler, is the only judge whose existence and authority can be verified by perception. And he alone determines right and wrong in society through verifiable material law and punishment. This completely sidelines the Brahmin priests and the concept of divine law, relocating all enforceable power into the verifiable secular structure of the state.
Okay, so the moment you reject an eternal soul, divine law, cosmic karma, and the afterlife, the philosophical focus has to shift entirely to the here and now. Logically, Cārvāka concluded that the purpose of life revolves around material well-being, artha, and pleasure, kama, as the highest goods.
They regarded pleasure, in itself and for itself, as the ultimate goal. This is the definition of egoistic hedonism. The highest ethical imperative is the maximization of one's own individual immediate pleasure.
This is the philosophy that earned them that label of crude and vulgar, forever summed up by the slogan, "Yavajivet Sukharashivet."
As long as you live, live happily. And their opponents use this slogan as a cudgel, constantly accusing Cārvāka of advocating unreflective, reckless, sensual gratification, often ignoring the social consequences.
But the Cārvāka thinkers offered a powerful and pretty nuanced defense against the prevailing ascetic philosophies.
They did.
So what was the main argument against pleasure coming from the ascetic schools?
The ascetics argued that pleasure should be avoided because it's inherently mixed with pain. Every moment of joy is either followed by suffering or it's so fleeting that the memory of its loss causes suffering. So the prudent person should avoid the pain, and to do that, you have to avoid the pleasure entirely.
And the Cārvāka response used that fantastic paddy grain analogy.
Yes, the materialists countered. Why would you reject fine grains of paddy just because they are covered with husk and dust? You don't abandon the entire pursuit of a valuable substance just because there are unavoidable difficulties in getting it.
Their point was that pleasure and pain are inseparable parts of life.
Exactly. The fact that pleasure is mixed with pain is no reason to relinquish pleasure. To avoid pleasure is illogical. Nobody stops cooking in fear of an approaching beggar, and nobody rejects a successful business venture just because of the stress involved.
That reframes their hedonism entirely. It suggests a kind of rational cost-benefit analysis applied to happiness. They weren't necessarily advocating reckless self-destruction.
No, they were advocating for the maximization of good experience within the finite limits of life. Precisely. Now, the extreme popularized view certainly pushed the envelope. This led to that famous instruction.
The one about taking a loan.
Yeah, that if necessary, one should take a loan to buy the ingredients for luxurious enjoyment, specifically butter, while one is alive, since the body, once reduced to ashes, cannot return.
Debt doesn't matter if death is final extinction.
That's the idea. It is the most radical interpretation. However, the sources also suggest a more moderate approach for some Cārvāka factions. They supported avoiding actions that caused harm to others.
But why? Not for moral reasons, right?
No, for purely practical ones. Harming others inevitably leads to social or governmental retaliation, which is painful and thus decreases your own overall pleasure.
So their goal was a kind of enlightened egoism, maximizing personal pleasure by minimizing avoidable pain, which includes the pain caused by legal or social consequences.
And that's where the historical parallels become truly startling. The philosophy of Aristippus of Cyrene in the 4th century BCD, a contemporary of Plato, is described as having a nearly identical doctrine to Cārvāka. He also believed that immediate sensual pleasure was the noblest goal of life.
And if you look east, the Chinese philosopher Yang Zhu taught something similar, that religious constructs were artificial, designed to control people, and that worrying over morality was a waste of time.
Right, time better spent enjoying life. But the crucial contrast is with Epicurus. While Epicurus also focused on pleasure, he taught extreme moderation. For him, pleasure was the absence of pain and distress, what he called ataraxia.
Achieved through self-control and tranquility of mind.
Exactly. Epicurus valued intellectual pleasure and long-term health. The crude Cārvāka, by contrast, championed immediate sensual gratification, even if it meant future inconvenience, because the future was uncertain and death was final.
It is just uncanny how Cārvāka, centuries ago, laid the groundwork for ideas that would later reshape the Western world. Their focus on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain as the sole ethical metric.
Yeah.
It just uncannily anticipates the core mechanics of utilitarianism.
Developed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Yeah. They essentially created a utilitarian framework without the social mechanism, applying it only to the individual.
Their importance, therefore, isn't just historical. It's a monument to the spontaneous generation of rational, materialist thought whenever thinkers are given the license to prioritize verifiable experience over faith.
Okay, so given how sophisticated and logically challenging Cārvāka's arguments were, it raises a critical question. If it was so influential that its enemies spent centuries writing detailed texts just to refute it, why did its own original works just vanish so completely?
Well, the systematic loss of the primary Cārvāka text, most notably the Barhaspatya Sutra, is not an accident of time. It was intentional intellectual suppression. Cārvāka survived mainly as the Purvapakan, the initial, often distorted, position set up in a philosophical debate text, only to be immediately and definitively knocked down by the orthodox Siddhanta, or conclusion.
So every time we read a Cārvāka argument, we're reading it through the biased lens of the philosophical victor, who often overemphasized its vulgarity and downplayed its logical rigor.
Precisely, and this bias colors our understanding of its origins. There's a long-standing debate about whether Cārvāka started at the top of society or at the bottom.
Let's talk about the less likely theory first, the royal theory.
Okay, the royal theory, which is now largely discredited by modern scholarship, linked materialism to the real politicers, practical politicians like Chanakya or legendary kings. The suggestion was that these powerful figures used Cārvāka ideas, no karma, no afterlife, to rationalize amoral or purely pragmatic actions.
A justification for might makes right.
Essentially, yes. But the evidence contradicts this, doesn't it? If materialism was the philosophy of kings, they would have protected it. Yet, the major lawgivers and the Dharmashastras uniformly and fiercely condemned the Nastika schools.
They imposed legal and social penalties on their followers.
And furthermore, we find no record of established Lokāyata kings in the extensive historical or epigraphic records. The narrative often cited, like the tale of King Paisi debating a monk and being philosophically defeated, is tailor-made to denigrate the materialist doctrine.
Which brings us to the more probable origin,
Mm-hmm.
the popular origin, rooted in social reform and skepticism.
Yes, materialism most likely originated with figures challenging the established spiritual order, like Ajita Kesakambalin, a senior contemporary of the Buddha in the 6th century BCE. He is widely recognized as the crucial forerunner of the later Cārvāka movement.
And this presents a fascinating historical paradox, because Ajita's own way of life seems to directly contradict that later charge of crude hedonism.
It does. His name, Kesakambalin, refers to his austere dress. He wore a blanket made of human hair, which would have been incredibly rough and uncomfortable. This suggests he was preaching uncompromising materialism and nihilism.
Not luxurious living.
Not at all. He was focused on the rejection of all religious duties and the denial of rebirth. An austere materialist. It suggests the early movement was driven by intellectual rigor, focusing on liberation from false concepts.
And that the later charge of eat, drink, and be merry might have been a deliberate libel. Or maybe it only applied to a more radical faction of the school that developed later on.
That paradox is a great reminder that the history we have is filtered. But the philosophy was persistent. Cārvāka survived, often as an intellectual bogeyman, well into the medieval period.
And we see its presence powerfully illustrated as a literary villain, right? In that 11th century Sanskrit play, Krabada or The Rise of the Moon of Awakening.
This play is key to how the elite perceived Cārvāka. It's an allegorical drama where abstract concepts become characters. The Cārvāka philosopher is strategically allied with King Mahamoha, or Great Delusion.
And they fight against the forces of discrimination and knowledge.
Right. Cārvāka is portrayed as the chief sophist, whose arguments, while clever, inevitably lead to self-destruction and moral anarchy.
This literary suppression really cemented Cārvāka's identity in the popular imagination as the embodiment of philosophical error and hedonistic chaos. And yet, despite centuries of this cultural and religious condemnation, Cārvāka thinkers hadn't vanished.
Remarkably, no. They were still present at the highest level of intellectual life in the 16th century. Emperor Akbar's famous interfaith debates at the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship at Fatehpur Sikri.
That is contemporary with the European Renaissance and Reformation. What exactly were these Cārvāka philosophers arguing in front of Akbar?
Abu Fazl, Akbar's court chronicler, he explicitly recorded their arguments. The materialists asserted their atheist views, focusing on the Cārvāka concept that thought and consciousness result purely from the equilibrium of material elements in the body.
So they were sticking to their core principles.
And critically, they argued that since all higher spiritual goals were unverifiable, the only legitimate sciences were those promoting just administration and benevolent government.
So they were presenting themselves as political scientists, as rational governance experts, prioritizing verifiable worldly management over unseen theological mandates. It proves that centuries after its foundation, Cārvāka maintained its identity as a sophisticated, rational alternative to faith-based governance.
And the discovery that Cārvāka philosophers were actively debating at Akbar's court in the 1580s provides a crucial intellectual anchor for the next part of our deep dive: the possibility of global influence.
As we've noted, these concepts, radical empiricism, determinism by nature, secular utilitarian ethics, they anticipate philosophical movements that would later reshape Europe during the Enlightenment. The echoes are just undeniable.
I mean, we're looking at a system that predates David Hume's rigorous empiricism, particularly his claim that belief in God is derived from instruction, not observation. Cārvāka argued that 2 millennia earlier.
And their individual focus on maximizing happiness aligns with the core mechanics of Benthamite utilitarianism. So was there actual traceable transmission of these ideas to Europe?
There was a definitive and documented transmission route of the knowledge that sophisticated Indian atheism existed, starting in the late 16th century. And it began with the Jesuit missionaries present at Akbar's court.
Specifically, Antonio Monserrate and Francisco Henriques, who were there in the 1580s.
They were eyewitnesses. They saw firsthand that a highly rational, highly developed philosophical tradition could exist and thrive entirely without reliance on God, revelation, or an immortal soul.
Which must have been earth-shattering information for 16th century European Catholicism.
Absolutely. They documented this experience, and those reports circulated widely. Their accounts were compiled and synthesized by others, notably the French Jesuit Pierre Dugéric, whose Histoire was read widely across Europe.
So this provided European intellectuals with solid, documented proof that atheistic philosophical systems were not just the drunken mutterings of simpletons.
Right, but could be intellectually coherent, logical, and ancient. And this contributed to the atmospheric intellectual climate of skepticism that fueled the Age of Reason. But the potential for direct, specific influence hinges on the story of the pioneering Sanskrit scholar, Heinrich Roth.
Roth was a German Jesuit, a remarkable linguist who arrived in Agra in the mid-17th century.
From 1654 to 1662, he immersed himself in Sanskrit and local philosophical schools. And crucially, Roth was the first European to produce detailed, accurate translations of texts describing the doctrines of various Indian philosophical systems, including the Cārvāka schools of thought.
So he didn't just report that atheism existed. He brought back the specific arguments, the detailed epistemology, the critique of inference, the 4 elements ontology.
Exactly. He had the detailed source material that could have directly informed the Age of Reason. He packed up these precious manuscripts and returned to Rome.
And this is where we encounter one of the great missed chances in the history of intellectual transmission.
Roth's detailed manuscripts were largely ignored. They remained unpublished in the Jesuit archives in Rome for nearly 300 years.
300 years, why?
They were simply too radical, too challenging, or perhaps too technical for the contemporary European audience or religious authorities to appreciate or publish immediately.
Just think of what that delay cost us. Had these nuanced descriptions of Cārvāka epistemology been published in the 17th century, they could have directly engaged and informed Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Hume, long before they finalized their core theories.
The specific Cārvāka critique of inference, for example, would have provided direct, rigorous, non-Western support for Hume's skepticism regarding causality and metaphysical truths. But by the time these materials were rediscovered and published, well into the 20th century, the Enlightenment was long over.
So we can conclude that the general knowledge of sophisticated Indian atheism reached Europe and helped loosen the intellectual ground for skepticism.
But the specific arguments that could have provided direct influence were locked away.
The influence was, as you said, atmospheric. It opened minds to the possibility, proving that rational atheism was a global phenomenon.
But it didn't provide the direct blueprints for philosophical construction that it certainly contained.
So the Cārvāka school stands today as a powerful monument to radical rationalism and critical thinking. It challenges the deeply ingrained notion that sophisticated philosophy must inevitably rely on faith, unseen forces, or spiritual mystery.
Its sheer endurance, maintaining its presence across millennia despite the intentional loss of its original works and continuous condemnation, confirms the universal human tendency toward materialism and skepticism, regardless of cultural context.
And its great legacy is not just what it believed, but what it forced others to do. Cārvāka contributed significantly to the development of Indian philosophy by compelling the orthodox schools, Vedanta, Nyaya, even Buddhism and Jainism, to significantly strengthen their logical arguments.
They had to strengthen their rational defenses and their epistemological justifications against this relentless materialist critique. It elevated the entire intellectual ecosystem.
It really did.
It raises an important question that summarizes the existential divide Cārvāka represented. Consider the famous story from the Katha Upanishad, the philosophical core of so much of Indian spirituality. Yama, the Lord of Death, tempted the young seeker Nachiketa, who sought spiritual truth, by offering him all the material joys of life.
Wealth, land, long life, a kingdom, pleasure.
Everything. And Nachiketa rejected this artha and kama for the mystery of the soul and the secret of death.
He chose the spiritual, unseen truth over the worldly, verifiable pleasure.
Cārvāka flips that narrative entirely. If perception is all we have and death is certain extinction, then rejecting all that verifiable wealth and pleasure for an unverifiable mystery would truly be the ultimate folly. Cārvāka fundamentally challenges the source of authority we submit to, whether it be sensory experience or sacred text. It raises an important question for you, the listener. In the face of certain death, what authority, spiritual or material, commands your loyalty?
Thanks for tuning into Sonara's Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future episodes. I bring you fresh content every week. Thanks for listening.